Justin Brown is the MD of Element 25.
Thanks very much for the introduction. So I guess a number of you are probably wondering what a manganese project is doing in a battery minerals conference. It's the metal that is least talked about, I think, amongst the complex of nickel, manganese, cobalt, lithium, etc. So it is my job, I guess, to teach you or explain to you as to why manganese is such an important metal in the future of electrification of the world. And I'm going to sort of focus around our 100% owned Butcherbird project as I try and do that in the short time that we have. We have had the Butcherbird project since about 2007 and have been developing it into the second largest resource in Australia. And in the last 5 years have been focused on developing it to produce manganese concentrates, but also take advantage of the evolution of high purity metal manufacture in Australia by taking this project into a high sort of a downstream processing scenario to produce high purity manganese, not just for batteries, but batteries have become a key focus in more recent times. But we have a journey where we've sort of set up the first module of production about 12 months ago. We've got about the first 3 shipments of manganese concentrate into the market. We've got expansion plans focused on getting that production up to about 1 million tonnes per annum of traditional manganese concentrate, but then very much focused on taking that concentrate downstream to produce high purity battery grade manganese sulfate for the battery industry to produce cathode materials. I guess manganese sort of traditionally to most people means a steel input. I guess it's similar to vanadium in that way. It's been known for hundreds of years as an ingredient in steel, an important ingredient, but more recently the focus has been shifting to the new energy market where manganese plays an important role as a cathode input. An increasingly important role, and that's why I think our timing is excellent in terms of being one of the first non-China producers of high-purity manganese sulfate for the production of lithium-ion batteries for vehicles and stationary storage. The project is located about 130 kilometres south of Newman, 100% owned by Element 25. Hosts about 260 million tonnes of resource at the moment, but further drilling will continue to expand that over time. It is genuinely a massive deposit. We've got granted mining tenure over about 100 million tonnes of that global resource, and we're currently producing at a nameplate production rate of about 365,000 tonnes per year of manganese concentrate, which we export through the Utah Point facility at Port Hedland. It's a fairly small footprint at the moment. It doesn't take full advantage of the size of the resource. We have pretty aggressive plans to expand production to up to 1 million tonnes per annum, which will start to take advantage of the size of the resource. But even at the current scale, just based on measured and indicated resources, we have a 42-year mine life. Even at the expanded 1 million tonne rate, we still have a 15-year mine life, and that's excluding about 2/3 of the global resource. So this thing is going to be in production for a very long time, decades, not years, like most mining projects in Western Australia. And I think our timing is fantastic in terms of taking advantage of the real sort of uptick in battery demand or battery manufacture demand for these key metal inputs. You've seen various versions of these graphs, I'm sure, ad nauseum over the last day or two, really just to reinforce that this transition to electrification is upon us. And just to point out that manganese is one of the key inputs into the cathode, and for various reasons which I'll touch on is probably going to become one of the more important inputs into the cathode, alongside nickel and perhaps a fading reliance on cobalt because of the geopolitical and ESG difficulties that metal has. So I guess this transition, if you're not already convinced, just a couple of slides to reinforce it. It's not an idea, it's happening. These are just a couple of graphs of the gigafactories that are either planned or in construction around the world, focusing on Europe and North America. That's not even counting the Chinese battery production. So This is very much a real trend. I probably don't need to shove that down your throat any further, except to say that I think if you look at the way this is going to play out, it's going to take decades, not years. So as a super cycle, it's going to be 20 years in the making, and it's perfect. It's the perfect time to be bringing these battery chemicals to market, because there's going to be an insatiable demand for them for not just this year, next year, but also the next couple of decades. We're kind of in that sort of first uptick, I think, which is why lithium and cobalt have sort of felt supply squeeze over the last few years. Nickel's starting to show signs of a supply squeeze, and we believe manganese is the next one, because for reasons I'll get to, it's going to become a more dominant input into these batteries in years to come. And one of the main reasons for that is that although nickel and cobalt have fantastic properties in their own right, they're not easy to come by. Cobalt in particular is sort of experiencing some real difficulties from the supply side because of the ESG, the social governance, environmental governance issues that surround it, the geopolitical challenges of guaranteeing supply from jurisdictions like the DRC. It's not an easy metal, and if you look at the supply forward-looking profile, it's just not going to satisfy the demand using conventional NMC 111 or 622 chemistries, and even when you get to 811, it's going to struggle. And nickel isn't much better, really. So if you're going to sort of satisfy the huge demand that these gigafactories are going to have on input, neither nickel nor cobalt are the panacea for the cathode materials. You've heard all about lithium, and I don't think lithium's going to go away anytime soon, but there is genuinely a transition away from dependence on cobalt, and you're going to see that happen with nickel as well, I think, to the extent that that's possible. LFP is being touted as a possible substitute, but it has its own issues with power, energy density, and the like. And a lot of in fact, all of the major battery manufacturers have a high manganese cathode in their runway, and you've heard Elon Musk talk about it. You've heard Volkswagen announce it publicly, and others are following as well. So manganese is the one metal that has the ability to satisfy the demand in the cathode part of the battery. And the other thing that it is quite important about it is that it's the most abundant of the three main cathode constituents, but it's the cheapest as well. And so those two factors make it a prime candidate to be a dominant battery metal for the next couple of decades. And our plan is to be in production around the end of 2024-25 with high purity manganese sulfate to tap into that demand, which I think is pretty certain. So what are we doing? So we've got a multi-stage development pathway for the project. The first stage is in production now and shipping out through Utah Point. We've got our fourth shipment away, and we've got pretty aggressive plans to expand that, as I've said, to about 1 million tonnes per annum of export of traditional concentrate into the steel industry. And the final stage and the real sort of uptick in growth for the company is going to be around conversion of increasing proportions of that production to high purity manganese sulfate for batteries, and doing that in an ESG and compliant and sustainable fashion, so that we can satisfy the supply security, the ESG requirements, and also the supply chain security, all of which are critical ingredients to the supply chain if you're going to sink tens of billions of dollars into battery gigafactories over the next couple of decades. The initial scoping study assessment that we released in February shows that the economics are pretty much a no-brainer. We believe that these commercial fundamentals, these drivers, will stay pretty static over the next few years, because I think that like lithium and like cobalt before it, and as you're starting to see with nickel, manganese will have the same issues around sufficient supply. And as an early mover into this space, I think we stand well positioned to really capitalise on that by being into the market as one of the first non-China producers of these high purity battery grade manganese chemicals. In terms of implementation strategy, obviously we have supply already established for the feedstock, which is the concentrate that comes from butcherbird already. And then one of the decisions we have to make is where to build our first conversion facility. It's quite easy to argue that the facility should be built in Australia, but it's also similarly advantageous to build it near the gigafactories, because the ore transports extremely well. The chemical product, the post-conversion, is a quite delicate, very high purity product that needs to be protected from the weather and the elements in a containerized logistics solution. So it's not impossible that our first module will be built in Asia or Europe or indeed the US. Although I would hazard a guess that excuse me, the US is the least likely for the first module because it's a little bit behind in terms of the uptake of or the infrastructure development of battery factories, but it's certainly coming on strong. I think, all of the speakers, I'm sure, have touched on the fact that if you're going to be part of this revolution, you need to be paying close attention to your carbon intensity and also the ESG sort of compliance of your project. The builders of these EVs don't want dirty metals in their clean cars, and justifiably so. You need to have a roadmap to low or zero carbon, and that's something that we've embarked on very early in the piece with a pretty clear picture of how we're going to achieve that, although albeit it's a multi-year journey and not all the technologies that we need are here right now. We know that we know what the main ingredients are, and we've done a lot of work on how we can design our flow sheet to be carbon neutral as possible and certainly not produce any untoward environmental sort of byproducts, environmentally damaging byproducts. Obviously, renewable energy is a key part of the mix, and we've done extensive work over the last 4 years on collecting wind and solar data at the site, and we know what that resource is and what role it can play in the future energy supply for the project. We have a heavy haulage component to our project, which is road trains up the Great Northern Highway. Obviously, ideally you would do that with hydrogen. That's not here yet, but we think that in a few years it probably will be, and that's a likely solution to that part of the problem. But I think above all that, you have to be transparent and accountable for your carbon footprint and your supply chain and ESG aspects of your production. And that's something that we have taken seriously. And one of the parts of that journey is to engage with Circular, who they offer a traceability service around supply chains. We're a customer of theirs, and we're developing a framework around our supply chain, which will allow customers to have very clear and transparent information on each cargo of manganese sulfate and indeed manganese ore that we produce from the project. And I think that's a work in progress. It's not, the solutions aren't all here, but I think the mining industry in general, but even perhaps more specifically the miners with aspirations to sell into the battery industry, which is part of the decarbonisation plan for the world, are going to have to be paying close attention to this part of the business as well. And we're pretty early movers on that front as well. So just to recap, really, we've got stage 1 under our belt. We've got stage 2 in advanced planning stages and close to implementation. Stage 3, which is the real focus of the growth part of the company's future, is the conversion of that production into high purity manganese sulfate. A feasibility study for that should be delivered in the third quarter of calendar 22. We've got good advanced discussions with various potential offtake partners, and I hope to bring news to the market on that shortly. And similarly, project financing in the second half of 2022 for a final investment decision sort of towards the end of the calendar year. We've got a pretty aggressive development timeline. We brought our first stage of our concentrate business on stream in about 12 months from PFS to first production, and we hope to take a similar aggressive strategy to the implementation of the first stage of the conversion business with the first commissioning in 2024 or 2025. So we're going to be very busy. I think our timing is pretty close to perfect, and I think you hear a lot more about manganese as a battery metal in years to come. And whilst I don't want to take any of the thunder away from the fun times lithium's had in the last 6 months or so, I think you're going to see similar patterns develop around other inputs into the battery supply chain, and manganese is very much one of those. So like I said, I think there's tailwinds ahead for us, but a lot of hard work to go with it, and we're getting into it. So thanks a lot. I think I'm slightly ahead of time, but thanks for listening.